Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we're going to discuss a recent vote in the European Parliament where EU conservatives voted with the far right to approve cuts to EU green rules. Then we will turn to a conversation with Federico Steinberg and Nicolas Véron to discuss the future of the euro and what it could mean for Europe's broader economic future. We hope you enjoy the show. Then that's the end. So what happened in the European Parliament? We tend to not talk that much about the European Parliament. It is probably one of the main EU institutions that probably gets ignored the most. Everyone likes to talk about the Commission and hate on the Commission, which is the executive branch. And then you have the European Council, which is basically like the Senate. It's all the heads of state that get together and fight it out, make decisions, and that kind of drives things. But there's this other plank of the EU, the European Parliament, and it made some big news this past week. So what happened?
Yes, there was a big vote in the European Parliament, and indeed we don't talk about the Parliament that much, at least on this side of the Atlantic, because it has important responsibilities on the budget stuff. But other than that, obviously the stuff that makes most news is coming out of the Commission and sometimes the Council, especially these days, because we talk about trade and tech a lot, for example. But the Parliament still has a lot of opinions, and there's hundreds of parliamentarians there. And this debate on the green rules has been going on for a while now. This was a big package that was passed. So that's something that's important to explain. These rules were already passed. But this year, because of all the talk about competitiveness, which we have discussed on this podcast, and trying to revive more European industry and European growth, there's a big push for what Brussels at least is calling simplification. Other parts of the political spectrum would call deregulation, to try to make it easier on companies. And some of the rules that were quote unquote simplified recently in the Parliament have to do with due diligence from companies and sustainability disclosures. A lot of companies have been saying that these are really onerous, that there's a lot of compliance requirements and it's very complicated for them to do this. There's some arguments to this. But what happened in the Parliament is the centrist faction, so what has been called basically von der Leyen's governing coalition in the Parliament, which goes from the center left to the center right. That's the Renew coalition, the Liberals, the Greens to some extent, the Socialists, and then the EPP, which is center right to right wing, depending on which country you're talking about for the members. They couldn't agree on a simplification package for those green rules. And things kind of broke apart at the end of October. And in the meantime, the EPP found other partners to vote on the simplification. Why is it making so much news is because the new partners are the far-right parties, and they're the far-right groups in the parliament. That's the European Conservatives and Reformists. That's Meloni's parliament group, for example. And the Patriots for Europe, that's the Marine Le Pen faction, Vox, Lega, and Fidesz, notoriously. And that makes a lot of noise because we've talked a lot in other contexts, including in the Dutch context more recently, about the cordon sanitaire, which is this agreement across a lot of Europe to not engage in governing coalitions with far-right parties. And the EPP broke this. So there's two different dynamics here. There's obviously the policy conversation around the green rules and whether they should be simplified or deregulated. And the other conversation is the political part. And that's what's really driving a lot of more centrist parties crazy in the past week in Brussels, because it's actually a big deal.
Yeah, I think maybe to take a step back, if we go back to June of last year, or I guess end of May, early June, that's when the European parliamentary elections were held. And there were elections across Europe. And the end result was the far right grew in strength, grew in the size and proportion that they had previously. The headline, though, coming out of those elections was actually that the center overall, and the center left and the center right held so that von der Leyen would get another term in office. But the center left did pretty poorly, and the Greens took a shellacking, as President Obama said after the 2010 midterms. And they did quite poorly. And part of one of the major issues of that election was sort of rolling back some of the Green Deal. I mean, the way I sort of interpreted it, I've said on the show, is that the Greens kind of got their agenda implemented during the first 5-year term. And here what we have is an effort to roll back some of that. Now, we had a whole conversation with Ben McWilliams of Bruegel a few months ago, where asking, well, is the EU turning its back on the green agenda? And the answer is no. It's actually still really moving forward with the green transition. But on some of these issues, especially the regulatory steps, there's an effort to sort of roll things back. And in particular, there's this regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Directives, CSDDD is what it's known as. It was passed in July 2024. So these are laws on the books. What they're essentially doing or trying to do, the EU as a regulatory power, the Brussels effect, is trying to force companies in Europe and around the world to move forward on transition, to have a climate change transition plan, to report, as these companies would describe endlessly, their emissions and where their products are from. And so this is the EU using the tool that it really has, which is a regulatory tool, to try to bring about change. Now, the companies are like, we're trying to make money here, and this is like onerous. The EU's response is, you're really big, and it mainly applies to really big companies, part of what was just watered down here. They are shrinking it even further. They're not getting rid of it wholesale. They're delaying implementation. The major thrust here is the EU trying to use its regulatory tool to push an ESG climate change agenda. The winds have sort of blown against that. I mean, incredibly strongly here, hurricane force in the United States. I would call it sort of a gust in Europe. And this was an issue where it had clearly been telegraphed for the past year that there was going to be some, let's revisit some of these regulations that have been put on the books. I think the question then becomes, is this, kind of an oath-breaking violation by the European People's Party of the center right to then work with the far right? They're all in alignment, generally on a deregulation approach and kick. So it is true that it's triggered by the EPP voting with the far right parties. What I would sort of suggest, though, is did the center left, did the Greens want to make a compromise here? And I'm not saying they should, because part of what has given the far right a lot of breathing space is that you don't really have an opposition, that you have a center right and a center left that are looking at both extremes, but mainly on the right, and say, oh my God, we have to work together and make all these compromises. And so the responsible, in air quotes, because we're on a podcast, governing coalitions, they sort of merge into one party. And I actually think creating a bit of a difference between the center right and center left, where the center left can say, we are still strongly in favor of climate change, and the center right being a little bit more climate skeptical or not wanting to push forward, I think creates like a very good cleavage in European politics, to use a political science term.
Yes. I think what's complicated here is that it just creates a rift, and it makes it harder for the EPP down the line to not keep doing this, first. And second, it makes it harder for them to point the finger at some far-right parties for other files that they care about, especially when we talk about governance and democracy and anything like that. I should say this is not brand new. Like, the EPP has been playing footsie with this for a while. And just thinking back to even how long it took the EPP to kick Fidesz and Orbán out of the political group, as you were saying, some of this was telegraphed. It's not that surprising, but it remains somewhat shocking.
It's also happening on the national level. Sweden, other countries where the center-right party needs the support of the far right. Dutch elections, the previous Dutch government was a far-right party, was the main party, needed support of others. The far-right leader didn't take the prime ministership because it would have been complicated. We talked about it in the last episode. So this has been happening at European politics, and it sort of makes sense to see it at the European level.
I think it's an interesting point that you make of ultimately we're starting to really import national dynamics into the parliament. And that's a long-standing debate in EU institutional scholarship, which I don't want to get too theoretical, but I think is relevant, is that for a long time, observers of the parliament have been saying, well, it's great because the parliament, which we could have assumed would naturally organize itself from the moment it was directly elected in 1979. It would organize itself between pro-EU forces and anti-EU forces, but it didn't really. Very quickly, it organized itself along traditional political lines. So center-left, very far left, center, whatever. It actually did function that way for a long time, but with the rise and then re-rise of far-right forces, there has been more of a necessity to have a strong pro-EU majority, which is why it's considered like von der Leyen's governing coalition, although it had happened in the mid-2010s as well, and an anti-EU majority. You could argue this is actually a turn back towards traditional political cleavages. And the EPP is making a policy and a political decision to align with whoever will vote with it on its priorities for this file. We should also say there's a lot of pressure coming from the Commission and the Council on anything that has to do with competitiveness. The green rules even touch defense because there's currently an issue of permitting for environmental rules and how long it's going to take for those factories, et cetera. It's just a question of should it be doing this at all costs? Now, there's also some other dynamics in the parliament. There's increasingly the use of secret ballots that actually the far right used to create a rift. So there's some political games that are being played in Brussels or Strasbourg, I guess, as well. But what's making it important is that this might change the dynamics we're going to see going forward, because this cooperation platform for von der Leyen that's been very loose already and was shaky might actually be a thing of the past going forward, especially for anything that has to do with competitiveness. I just don't know what that looks like for important things that would come up, again, as I was saying, on governance, on democracy issues. They need to stand strong on that. But I'll just say there's also other things coming down the pike on deregulation for things like deforestation, biodiversity, and digital, which is not necessarily on the climate file, but is going to be a big, big topic of debate. And we might see more of this dynamic playing out.
I just saw the deforestation directive, which is similar in some ways to the CSDDD about reporting requirements or proof of origin. That has also been punted, I think, for a year. That's what Germany is pushing. And my guess is that probably gets punted, I guess, with something we'll track. I think there's a lot of attention on where the far right is extreme. And sometimes we don't really pay attention to how the far right has become less extreme. 10 years ago, prior to Brexit, I think it was 16 or 17 of the sort of more prominent far-right parties were all for leaving the European Union. We're for exiting. In our conversation with Federico and Nicolas points out that Marine Le Pen was for getting France off the euro 10 years ago. Post-Brexit and where we are now, that's not popular. And so this whole anti-EU, in air quotes again, I think has to be a little bit complicated. Is Meloni anti-EU? She's benefiting from Next-Gen EU funding. So what I sort of see happening is that there's different vision on the far right of what Europe should look like. That's not necessarily coherent. They kind of have softened actually some of their anti-EU sentiment that if there is far right governments that take over, it's not going to sort of trigger the kind of end of the union, which was the thinking 10 years ago. There are variations. All these parties are not the same. The AfD is very different than Meloni's Brothers of Italy. I think that variation is in some ways important. And then that creates a more freewheeling political dynamic where to tell the center right that you couldn't ever work with these parties to the right of you strikes me as sort of both no longer operable and not good for the center left. Because if I was on the center left, the key now is I think that they have no real message or vision for Europe. They're kind of all over the place across Europe. And I think it's helpful then to have perhaps a more cohesive center right that then creates a bit more clarity in where the parties stand. I could be wrong there, but I think if the center left was going to make a compromise to roll back regulations on climate, I don't think that would be good for them potentially in the long run about, where voters see them as what their priorities are.
I agree with that to some extent because I just personally believe it's important for voters to see contrast. And that's why I think parliamentary systems, for example, are helpful. Well, not the one in Belgium. Not the one with 7 parties in a coalition. But, if you vote for someone, you should see the results. This is what it means when I vote for this party. And when the platforms get muddled, I agree it's a problem politically and on the policy side as well. I don't really want to say that the far-right parties have mellowed out too much. That's not what you were saying. I know that. But I think it's a two-way street. It's two directions. The far-right parties have at least softened their message on what they think of the EU. I think there's still a strong ideological platform that Brussels should be diminished as much as possible. But also, center-right parties have moved to the right at the national level and at the European level, and they meet closer there. I see some descriptions of this whole thing in the press, depending on the article you were reading, would say something like centrists align with right wing. It's not really. It's center right to right wing is aligning with far right. Obviously, on the anti-EU, it depends how you define this. It's no longer about destroying all of the EU, but it's removing a lot of its power and moving it back to the national level. So I just really want to emphasize that because there's a lot of things on which they're still quite extreme. Yeah. And I know that's not what you were saying.
No, but I think the center right has moved right on some things, obviously on climate, we've seen a shift. And I think the whole kind of cultural backlash that has really occurred here in the US is also there, and they're tapping into that. But when you still look at where Europe is today versus 5 years ago, where the frugals are, it's just like not in the same place. I don't think it's that clear cut. And I think center right, center left alignment was sort of, in some ways, almost indistinguishable, at least to me as an outsider. For many countries, the policies that are going to be pursued, very hard to differentiate. And that's sort of where Macron, kind of as a straddler of sort of both sides, represents that in some ways. I think where Europe is evolving to is that there's sort of problems, I would say, on both flanks, where the kind of left needs to figure out what its economic, social, European agenda is. And I think that's also sort of true on the far right. Like, what do you actually want to do at the European level? And I think that it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves going forward. Before kicking it over to our interview, there is also been some breakthrough on another topic that we've been following, the reparations loan for Ukraine. This is how Europe can basically finance supporting Ukraine with the US stepping back. The commission came out with a study that basically gave three options. It's a classic thing you do in government, where you're like, here are your three options. Option A sucks. Option B sucks a little bit less. And option C is just like perfect. Why wouldn't you go with option C? Option C to the commission is the reparations loan. Nicolas, in our interview, he gave a really good articulation of why it makes sense. My view was you should just keep it in reserve and do Eurobonds. It seems like option B for the commission was like just do Eurobonds, which the interest rate would be higher. This is what Nicolas points out. But I think is probably something Europeans are going to have to do anyway, because I don't think this war is ending anytime soon. But that, I think, is drawing a lot of attention in Brussels. And my guess is come December, we're going to have some breakthroughs on a way forward here.
Yeah, and that would be another place where I think we would see different political lines for this. And as you were saying, it's going to be a more variable political geography for a lot of these different topics. That's a great way to pivot to your conversation that you just had with Federico Steinberg and Nicolas Véron. We're going to play just a snippet of the conversation so that our listeners don't have to listen to an hour-and-a-half episode of the Eurofile. Let's turn now to that conversation.
Welcome to an inaugural live recording of the Eurofile. We're going to have a great conversation today because we're going to dive into the future of the euro and the future of the European economy. There's been a lot of disruption and concern about high U.S. debt, about U.S. economic policies, about the disruption to the global trading order. And that has led to questions about maybe there's another safe asset out there in the world besides the U.S. dollar. Perhaps that could be the euro. The euro is a currency that has been created over the last few decades and has been increasingly used by more and more EU member states. Now, 20 EU member states use the euro, used by 350 million Europeans. And so it's become quite an important currency and is also important to the future of the European economy as Europe looks to the future of all the things that it needs to fund, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's its remilitarization, whether it's supporting its elderly as they continue to age. So with that, we're going to have a fantastic conversation today. I am joined by two excellent colleagues. First, Federico Steinberg is a visiting fellow here with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSAS. He's also the Prince Astorius Distinguished Visiting Professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and he's a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, close friends of CSIS. He also specializes in international political economy with a strong focus on European economic and monetary integration. And then we are really excited to have Nicolas Véron. He's a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's also with Bruegel, where he helped create Bruegel. Bruegel is one of the leading think tanks in Brussels, really thinking about European economic policy from the center, from the core of where it really takes place in Brussels, I guess, as well as in Frankfurt, where the European Central Bank is. His research focuses on financial systems, on financial reform around the world, including global financial regulatory initiatives and current developments in the European Union. Federico, maybe I could start with you. The European Union is right now having this big debate, discussion about reparations loans. Basically, what's happening is the EU is realizing that the United States is no longer going to be a major financer of both Ukraine's economy and its military. The last year, we had the United States Congress pass massive amount of funding for Ukraine, and there's no that's not going to happen. It looks like under the Trump administration. So Europe is looking at ways to tap funding, and they're looking at frozen Russian assets that are in the Belgian financial institution Euroclear, and so they're thinking about not necessarily seizing that money, but doing a loan based off of those assets. It's rather complicated. And the question is, why don't they borrow more? And maybe you could talk a little bit about Eurobonds and how you sort of see the current state right now of the euro, and how the Europeans are looking to leverage the euro to finance all the things that they need to spend on.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for having me again. And I guess we'll discuss the loan with Nicolas, who has been working extensively on this issue. Let me start with this basic idea of hegemonic currencies and why this matters. Basically, the dollar is the global hegemonic currency. It has been so for at least last 70, 80 years. There's some academic discussion there, interwar period or after 1945. Clearly, having the capacity to issue the global reserve currency gives you a number of advantages. It reduces the cost to finance for governments, for households, for companies. Basically, Ken Rogoff has a new book about the hegemony of the dollar, saying that on average, maybe it's like 0.5% to 1% cheaper for the US to finance itself. That's important. And then when we talk about geoeconomics and power, the dollar can be used as a weapon, but this is kind of dangerous sometimes because as people like Abe Newman and Nicolas has pointed out, weaponizing the dollar can be advantageous, but can also be tricky because others might think twice about using it less. So overall, the European Union has, issued the euro, created the euro in 1999. Then, there was this horrible, terrible financial crisis and Eurozone crisis 10, 15 years ago. Many people thought that, particularly in the US, that, since the euro is not an optimal currency area, perhaps there would be exit from the euro, particularly Greece. But at this point, I think it's clear that the euro is going to stay here. It's when you ask people, do you think the dollar is going to be around in 50 years? Everybody says yes, probability 99.5%. You ask the same question about China, probability 99.7%. But then when you ask about Europe, I think it's in the high 80s, but it's not that high, right? So the idea is you need some fiscal union, some deeper political integration. And then, as you were mentioning, in the current context, that the euro has established a reputation, particularly with a leading role of the European Central Bank, low inflation, rule of law. And in the discussion about having, more geo-economic weapons or the new toolkits, the Eurozone is doing a lot on trade, but this is the financial part. There's this discussion of, let's issue more common debt. Let's issue more Eurobonds, which could potentially reduce the overall cost for Europe and finance some of these European public goods. Defense, of course. There's a prior experience with next generation EU funds. This has worked, I would say, quite well, both in terms of, helping the European economies get out of the COVID crisis. But then it's, there's a big discussion about if the political consensus is there. It doesn't seem to be there, and some obstacles. But I guess we can discuss this deeper with Nicolas.
Maybe let me follow up. I think you've done a great job setting the stage, and I was sort of jumping ahead to the final act. But maybe to set the stage a little bit more, you could talk about. There's been a lot of controversy about the euro, and your point about. Is the euro going to be there in 50, 100 years? I would say yes, but I could see the level of confidence. And if you're an investor, that's a crucial issue. And maybe for both of you, how do you reflect so far on the history of this currency? What sort of drove it? The controversies that happened over in the euro crisis, where you had differing rates of borrowing, especially between the South in Europe and the North, which still exists somewhat today, but the sort of fractures within the European economy, then having a common monetary policy, a common currency, not really having a common fiscal policy. There's a lot of deep debates in the economics field about whether this was a wise course of action. Where are both of you now on where we are currently with the euro? So I think that sort of sets the stage before we go into, should the Europeans start, issuing a lot more debt? But Nicolas, maybe start.
I think the first thing that has to be said is that the first thing is thanks for having me. The second thing that has to be said is the euro has passed its first tests of resilience. As Federico rightly said, the Eurozone crisis was a major existential sequence that lasted about 10 years, from 2007 to 2017, I would say, had several moments of climax, one in 2011, 2012, a second one in 2015 with Greece. And really, there were many moments during that sequence during which it looked like the euro might disappear overnight, that there could be a breakup in the very near term. We're no longer there. So for at least the last 8 years, we've no longer had this perception that the eurozone was at immediate risk of breaking up. And that may come back. I don't think it will come back the same way we had it during the Eurozone crisis, precisely because the Eurozone crisis has demonstrated to the world, but also to Europeans, that the euro was much more resilient than it was often given credit for. The second point, or the other point I want to mention at this early stage of our conversation, is how popular the euro is with European public opinion. And you see that in every single member state, of course, with some differences, some variation from one member state to another. But the eurozone the euro as a currency is overwhelmingly popular with public opinion. It's not an elite phenomenon. In many ways, you might have more nuances in that support in the elite than in the population at large. Indeed, that support is rising, not decreasing. So at this point, the level of support in public opinion is at record high. I'm mentioning that because that's not necessarily what you get from the international news coverage of the Eurozone. And it's an important reality, which is very well established in all the opinion research there is, including reference studies like Eurobarometer, but also many others. So when you see, for example, the French far right. 10 years ago, Mrs. Le Pen was advocating Frexit, the exit of France from the Eurozone. She believes, apparently, that this made her lose the election in 2017, and she's no longer advocating it. So I think this is very illustrative of the fact that the Eurozone has not only demonstrated a capacity for survival, but really won the hearts and minds, in many ways, of the European public.
Yeah, I would add up to what Nicolas was saying, that the political capital that has been invested in the Euro project is really difficult to understand outside of the European Union. The sacrifices that, for example, some of the Baltics made to join very fast, the sacrifices that some of the Southern European countries made in order for the Euro to survive were really remarkable. And this is something that, is creating sociologists. The sociology of money has a research line on this about, having lived through this experience together, young generations don't even think in terms of the old currencies. This has something. However, and this is very important, the euro is still...
Can I just say on that? I remember in backpacking around Europe and going through France, Spain, and Italy in 2001, and have francs, pesos, lira, changing money, Deutschmarks, and then suddenly on January 2022, all one currency. It was this sort of shock to the system, but in a shock that was in a continent that was increasingly becoming integrated. People were traveling back and forth. It made things easier. I think not just for people traveling around, but for businesses and for others in Europe. But
absolutely, I was going to say. For Europeans, the European Union many times is Schengen, so capacity to move without showing your passport. The euro, not having to exchange money, and then the Erasmus program if you are studying at the university and having this experience. But the point I was going to make is that this doesn't mean that the euro is completely well constructed in its architecture. So basically, and we'll talk about this, there have been some important efforts in a number of issues, supervision of the financial system. Nicolas is an expert on this, but also some people still say that this is an orphan currency. Basically, it's not clear who the ultimate taxpayer in the Eurozone is, and this is important for markets. And also the issue of the fiscal union and of the different elements of the banking union. There's no deposit insurance mechanism scheme at the Eurozone level. So there are things that need to be done domestically to reinforce financially the Eurozone, and then think about Eurobonds, think about the foreign affairs part of the European Monetary Union.
That's true, but I think the way to think about it is that during the Eurozone crisis, the risks that could lead to the breakup of the Eurozone were very close. We were close to the cliff edge at several moments. At this point, they appear very remote. And I think they are indeed very remote. And we'll discuss that. What is the plausibility of a scenario that could lead to breakup? I think at this point, the plausibility is very low and likely to remain so. Of course, it's never zero. It's not zero for the United States. It's not zero for China. Federico alluded to that. It's certainly not zero for the Eurozone, but I think we're talking about increasingly remote scenarios. There's a twist to that, which is the more remote the scenario, the less pressure there is to act. And I think we will come to the things that should be done to make the euro even more resilient, even more sustainable. And they're politically difficult precisely because the scenarios of breakup are so remote, and that's not a prompt to action. Now, you mentioned 20 member states. Let's not forget, in a few weeks, there will be 21. Yes. Bulgaria will join, and you will be able to backpack to Sofia and the beautiful landscapes of that country without having to change into the local currency.
On that, this is like the basic landscape, and I would say here is where perhaps for the first time external factors might accelerate work towards deeper economic, financial, and monetary integration in Europe, which would be something really new because, up until now, the European project has moved forward basically because of domestic forces.
The full interview will be posted on this Eurofile podcast feed, or you can go to csis.org/events.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.